What I want to cover in the next 19 and a half minutes is about the EPAD project itself. As Jose Luis said, this has been a project that's been running for almost 5 years now across Europe as an IMI-funded project. And I'll talk a little bit about the background to the project, which is of course 5 or 6 years old, but and then emphasise I think there still is an ongoing need for the work that we're delivering currently in EPAD. And then I'll talk about the project structure, and with reference particularly to the participants in the project, the cohort study, the trial, and the academy, which in some ways we see as the key assets that have been developed over time within EPAD. Then I'll talk about what we're planning to do in the future, because the project itself, the funding comes to an end from IMI in June 2020. So obviously over the last couple of years, we've been very actively considering how we maintain the project beyond that, and in fact, maybe even expand it. And then if I have time, I'll talk about how the data from the project is going to be made open access, some of the data in a few days' time. So, background. The brain's pretty complicated. Alzheimer's disease is complicated. People are complicated. And I was chairing a session yesterday when we discussed the fact that it's time to embrace this complexity. I think for too long we've seen Alzheimer's disease, Alzheimer's dementia, certainly at a clinical level, as being quite straightforward and simple, and we've oversimplified it to the detriment sometimes of our patients. And what this little cartoon is trying to illustrate is that we are at a point now where we can embrace this complexity in terms of the biological processes that take place in the brain many years before dementia develops. So a lot of those colours and those little short sort of words are things like vascular pathology, tau pathology, mitochondrial dysfunction. This isn't trying to remember. This is just an illustration of a cartoon of what we're trying to do by getting data in the preclinical and prodromal period of neurodegenerative disease that will allow us to really understand what is going on in the brains of people many years before they develop dementia. And I think one of the critical take-home messages from this is we really do believe now, or we know now, that the diseases that lead to dementia probably start at least in your 30s or your 40s. And one of the reasons perhaps that trials have been failing historically is we've tended to use very specific interventions against one key pathology, if you like, quite late in the course of the disease. What ideally we should be doing, and we will be doing, is trying to hit these pathologies at an earlier stage and maybe a couple of pathologies concurrently. So I think, again, just as a little illustration of this, that up until very recently, we have been considering neurodegenerative diseases through the prism or the lens, if you like, of the dementia syndrome. And I think this is prevented us in some ways from really understanding what goes on in the earlier stages of the disease. So projects like EPAD and Alpha and other cohort studies are really now looking at generating huge amounts of data in this earlier stage of neurodegenerative diseases to really understand what's going on. And a lot of that will rely on biomarkers, brain imaging, spinal fluid, blood, and looking at genetic interactions, etc. What is the other reason, the other background to EPAD? So number one was we need to understand more about the disease before dementia develops. Number two is that we've been very poor developing drugs to try and mitigate the effects of these diseases over time. And I think this is as true now as it was several years ago when EPAD was initiated. So we sort of looked at this and said, well, what do we think are the underlying reasons that the drug trials aren't working? Number one, we thought probably we weren't going in early enough, so it's a disease stage. Number two, when you go in earlier, how do you measure outcomes? How do you say your drug is working? Thirdly, there seemed to be a huge drive to get drugs to market as quickly as possible. We might still be seeing that. And that meant that drug trialists weren't spending enough on what's called phase 2, or the learning stages of drug development, before going into large phase 3 trials. And there was also very restrictive costs in the way that people did trials. Every single drug trial that's been conducted over the last 20 years has started afresh, if you like, setting up centres, setting up CROs, setting up patient recruitment methodologies. So what EPAD's doing is setting up a platform in Europe so you can kind of plug and play. That's all set up for you, and all you have to do is bring your drug. So that's what EPAD's seeking to do. So what about EPAD? What is the structure? And I'll bring in Neuronet at this point too. So Neuronet is a federation in some ways of all of the IMI projects which have interest in Alzheimer's disease. Because I think when we look at some of those challenges, particularly around disease modelling, it's not only within EPAD that we can achieve the objective of finding out what is happening in the preclinical prodromal phases. There are many studies also funded by IMI which are also looking to understand elements of that process, and we can work very well collectively. EPAD is a consortium of 39 partners, public-private consortium. Alzheimer Europe is also a partner in EPAD. And it's probably worth mentioning that it's a 64 million euro funded project. So it's a very large project. We believe it's probably the largest Alzheimer's project currently anywhere in the world. This is a kind of the simple structure of EPAD, and that's got 3 main components. Number 1 is a register on the left-hand side of the slide. That register feeds participants or people into the cohort study, and the cohort study then finds the best people or the fit the requirements of the clinical trial. We have one single clinical trial that has multiple what we call appendices, and that's different drugs. So it's a platform trial that is consistent, and then several changes to that platform trial design on the basis of what your drug is meant to be doing in terms of the safety as well. I'll talk about the outcome measures more in a moment. I won't dwell on this, but the project itself is broken down into 8 work packages, each of which have a particular role in the study to make sure it works effectively. One of the things that we did right from the very beginning was, in a sense, not just sort of engage with participants as kind of, we design something and what do you think of it. We've taken from the very beginning the participant's voice as a collaborative voice within the way we've designed this trial. And the way we've done that is by establishing what we call participants panels. So sorry, Brian, I said you were. I didn't have a photo of you. So there you are. You've been highlighted at the General Assembly in Amsterdam. So one of the things that we do is we've set up these participant panels. And the aims of the participants panels is to give us feedback on their participation in the trial, to give us their ideas about what we think we should do next, and also to sort of act as a sounding board for decisions we may make already from an ethical perspective or a delivery perspective. And we have participants panels across Europe, most active being in Spain, France, and in the UK. But each of the countries involved in EPAD are also setting up their own participants panels, and then they feed into a Europe-wide panel. What about the cohort? Cohort is now, will be by the end of the year set up in 40 trial delivery centres across 11 countries. And you can see the list of open sites and recruiting sites there on the right-hand side of the figure. I think one of the most important, if you like, assets that we're developing within EPAD is our data. And as we try and understand what is going on in the brains of people before dementia develops, we want to be as comprehensive as we possibly can be in terms of what we collect from individuals. So every single participant in the EPAD cohort study gives annual cerebral spinal fluid. So each has a lumbar puncture, because we believe that proteins in the CSF are probably one of the best reflections of what's happening in the brain of individuals. We spend a lot of time working out exactly how to measure cognition in the brains of people or in people who may be at early stages of Alzheimer's disease. We spent 2 years designing what we call the EPAD neuropsychological evaluation, which has been published and is being used. But we didn't just want to know what was happening in the brains of people who might be at risk of developing dementia. We want to know why they were at risk of developing dementia, developing Alzheimer's disease. So a very comprehensive list of genetic or non-modifiable risk factors, as well as modifiable risk factors, which allow us to look at maybe mechanistic understandings related to an individual's risk profile. So how are we doing? Well, I mean, it's an incredibly detailed assessment. It takes about 2 or 3 days for the participants in terms of the scanning, the lumbar puncture, the cognitive evaluation. This takes place every year. But despite that complexity and despite the efforts that have to be made on the part of the participants, we have recruited almost 2,000 people across Europe. So it makes it the largest cohort study of its kind anywhere in the world. We have derived so much knowledge and understanding from projects like ADNI or ABLE. EPAD's a lot bigger than that and will continue to grow in the years ahead. And that data is going to be open access, so the whole research community can benefit from the data we're collecting. This just illustrates, in some ways, the commitment, if you like, not just from participants, but also from the sites. So to the left of this is the site. You won't be able to read the bottom of it. But these are the sites, if you like, that opened 3 or 4 years ago. And Jose Luis site, for instance, has recruited 250 participants at one single site. So it's not just a commitment of the research of the participants, it's also an incredible commitment from researchers, investigators, who really believe in this project and its potential benefits. So the third thing is the trial. I won't go into this in great detail. I've mentioned already that what we have is a single protocol for the clinical trial. It's what's called a Bayesian adaptive phase 2 proof of concept trial, which essentially means this is a learning space that we want to understand about how a drug works, what doses work, any particular populations it may work best in. 90% of the protocol is in the master protocol, but each drug company or each intervention owner can change the protocol a little bit. They can add to it by saying we want this particular safety assessment, or we want a particular biomarker assessment that matches onto how we believe our drug works. So in some ways, we have this proof of concept trial, the grey bar, and each of the single drugs will have their certain protocol. And one of the key advantages of doing this is that we can share placebo. So the placebo that comes from drug study A, drug study B, drug study C can be pooled together. So more people will be exposed or take the active compound as opposed to placebo, okay? Because we can share the placebo between arms. Now I might ask you to take this down. This is why it takes a long time to set these things up and cost 64 million euros, because the actual infrastructure that goes in behind these developments is absolutely vast and very complicated and needs to be done very, very well. The proof of concept trial is sponsored by the University of Edinburgh, which means that companies coming in with, dare say, their prized assets have to have confidence that the platform is to an industry standard. So we spend a lot of time, particularly with our CRO, clinical research organisation, IQVIA, in setting up these various elements to give assurance, if you like, to not only to the participants who come into the trial, but also the intervention owners, that the drugs can be run to the highest possible standard. We have one drug about to start probably May, June next year, and several others in the pipeline. So we're ready to go with the proof of concept trial in the summer of next year. Finally, in this section, just talk about the Academy. So we always knew that we were going to generate mass amounts of data, and we wanted to make sure that the early career researchers were in some ways the principal beneficiaries of the academic output. So we set up very purposefully an academy, and this is 60 people who are working across the project, who are either PhD students or 5 years within getting their PhD or their MD. And they have particular meetings, they have particular webinars, they have exchange programs, one between VUMC and BBRC, for instance, is taking place, just finished? Yeah, it's finished. So these are things where we've really put a lot of emphasis on our early career researcher development. So, EPAD, what we're going to do with this project has been funded by IMI towards the next sort of 5-10 years. So these are our key assets, if you like. These are the things that we think are worth maintaining. We have this register, I haven't spoken much about it, but it's got tens of thousands of people across Europe on the register. We've got the trial delivery centres, a trial network. We've got the platform trials framework developed. We've got the academy, and we've got the cohort study and the participants panel. So again, a really horrible slide, not really for showing at meetings, but this is more sort of internal purposes. But this is what we've decided to do. We decided to take those 5 components and set them up in a way where they're separately governed, separately funded, but do obviously interact. So a more simple way of looking at this is like this. So this is where Neuronet comes into its own as well, because it'll help us manage these assets and see how they're available and how they're useful for other projects within the IMI portfolio. The trial delivery network, the register, the cohort study, the trial platform, and because Toulouse are now going to manage the academy, it's called l'Académie. Okay, yay! Go Europe. I haven't mentioned Brexit yet, have I? Not bad. Okay, and within the EPAD cohort, for instance, there's additional assets or utilities. We've got one of the biggest biobanks for neurodegenerative disease, biomarkers, etc. It probably is the largest. And we also will have the capacity to add on studies. So if somebody wanted to do a study with an app or retinal imaging, it doesn't cost much to do it within our cohort because all the other data is being collected already. So Neuronet, I showed this slide earlier. In some ways, when we look at the collaborations that we've developed over the last few months, this is a kind of the domain where EPAD, now there's other domains you could draw with other IMI projects, but these are the ones that we're collaborating with actively at the moment, showing that sort of value, that efficacy from working collectively between projects. So I'm almost finished. Data access and releases. Again, not for taking down, but these things are exceptionally complicated. To do this well to the highest possible GCP standards, to make sure that when you analyze our data, the data we've generated, you have assurance in the results because of the quality of the data that we've been generating. So this is quite a big team of people who are involved in that. We've got a very good system. Now I would ask that if you've got time to write down that address at the bottom, because that explains how you get data access, and it's obviously going to be circulated quite broadly, because like I said, we are now open for data access from around the world for anybody who wants to look at it. We've got a very good system of logging in to get what we call the WiseHive system to make your application. Once your application has been approved, which usually takes about 4 hours, by the way, not months and years like some databases. It takes literally minutes if somebody's at their desk and can just click the button. Then you get your access, then you get created a workspace which you can use to access the data you've requested. And also within this system, you can actually use sort of publishing software and figure and to generate figures, tables, etc., to make it even easier to write your manuscripts. So this is I think my penultimate slide. We've released already the baseline 500 participants, version 500. That means it's 500 participants, 0.0 the baseline visit. The embargoed release was on 18th of May 19. So open data access will be 18th of November. So that's when this will go live to the entire academic community. V1500, so that's going to be a huge data set, a really important data set, will be released 28th of November. That's what we're targeting at the moment, which means the open data access after a 6-month embargo period for within the partnership will be May next year. And then, of course, the annual follow-ups of these will be at the times you can see there. These are the publications that we've had thus far. It's 2 pages of this. Now, we've got about 20-odd publications, but that without any data. So these are our position papers, our methods papers, our systematic reviews, etc. In fact, I think the only paper that's actually been published with V500.0 is one of my PhD students in Edinburgh who looked at multimorbidity and amyloid status. But you can expect, of course, over the next few weeks, lots of publications on the V500 database. So, finally, EPAD is part of, I think, what you'd consider to be a collection of a huge number of projects. This is a timeline about how these things have developed. You've got ABLE, you've got ADNI, you've got EPAD, you've got AMIPAD, which Jose Luis will talk about in a minute. And I think one of the challenges we face is it's all good and well to coordinate what's happening within EPAD, but EPAD has to coordinate itself with these huge projects elsewhere in the world. And these are this is the cool club. This is the groups of consortia that have been developing over the years that we need to make sure work really, really closely together. And Neuronet's just joined the cool club. EPAD's been in it for a few years already. So I think what I see when I look at this slide is a real sense of optimism and hope that the academic community, the researchers, participants, the public are all really coming together, and the funders really well against some of the key objectives that we have to prevent dementia. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Okay. You can. There's lots of things you can do. Facebook. We've got a YouTube channel. We've got a Twitter account. We've got a website, etc. So please have a look at that. And of course, I have to show you that and our acknowledgements and thanks to IMI. Thank you very much.